must have been in a really bad mood when doing this episode, since a lot of these games really irritated me, including a game that a lot of people really love. And then of course there are also some indisputably awful games today as well. But we also have a lesser known game that is really good, so it all balanced out in the end. Let's finish up March 1988 and then move on to April. I'm going to start this episode off with a healthy dose of vitriol. Let's take a look at our first game, Olympus no Tatakai from Imagineer/Wavejack, a game which is much loved by apparently everyone on Earth but me. A couple years later, this was released in the US by Broderbund as Battle of Olympus. The game rather helpfully gives you a map at the very beginning, or rather you think it might be helpful at first, but actually traveling around the world is done Castlevania 2 style, using interconnected side-scrolling sections. Now, for the most part, Battle of Olympus is a bog-standard side-scrolling adventure game. You alternate between walking in rooms and talking to NPCs, and fighting monsters on the roads connecting your destinations. Obviously the rooms here look very similar to those in Zelda 2, to which this is almost always compared to in the United States. Though in some ways it actually has more in common with Castlevania 2. Some of the later levels even look heavily Castlevania inspired. Battle of Olympus tends to front-load many of its hints. That is, the first part of the game has tons of NPCs telling you about all this stuff about staff of this or the cave of something or another. Because you just started playing, you really have no idea what anyone's talking about or really what this has anything to do with your quest. Once you start encountering your first enemies, they're like regular slimes, except they jump out of trees, and then they crawl on the ground below the reach of your sword. You have to kill them when and if they happen to actually jump at you. Now every level has a couple doors that lead to another part of Greece, as well as many doors that lead to other parts of the same area. So this world is constructed with lots of interconnected side-scrolling passages. From the starting area, Arcadia, you can find doors to Attica, where we are here, and Argolis. As a rule, your sub-goal in each area is to find some required magical item or weapon, and frequently to speak to the god in the local temple, who will usually give you the necessary magical item. The main purpose is to rescue your girlfriend from Hades. The story is based very loosely on the legend of Orpheus and Eurydice, though the manual calls them Orpheus and Helene for some reason. Various figures from Greek mythology make appearances, and the whole ancient Greece theme is more accurately depicted than Kid Icarus. Fighting enemies will yield one of two things: an olive used as currency in the game, or a bay leaf, which will restore one section of your health bar. You will sometimes need to buy a required item from a god or goddess using olives. So you might have to do a bit of sort of grinding, killing monsters, hoping to get those rare olives. Now, the first real boss in this game is called Lamia. And for a first boss, she is perhaps just a little too tough. She is constantly firing arrows at you, which your magic shield can deflect if you're standing really far away from her. Get up close and you'll still get hit or go right through your shield. So you'll need to jump over her arrows, land within about 1 pixel accuracy in front of her, hit her, then quickly back up before she shoots another arrow. Being just the tiniest bit off will result in either touching her when you land, hitting an arrow as you're jumping, or landing just a teeny bit too far, your sword not reaching her, and then immediately getting an arrow to the face. She's more difficult than any boss in, say, Castlevania or Mega Man, and this is just the first boss. Now once you defeat her and rescue a child, she kidnapped, you get a reward, which is the Staff of Fennel, stronger than your club you start off with. Now wait a second, say, the staff is made out of fennel? How can you make a weapon out of fennel? Even odder, it shoots fireballs. Now once I got to Argolis, I found the standard enemies becoming increasingly cheap and frustrating, especially the bats, which tend to swoop down and hit you on the head, out of reach of your sword. And that's the thing about this game, almost every single enemy is just a little too high or too low to actually hit, or is constantly moving up or down or jumping at you. It felt like an entire game is full of Medusa heads and Igors from Castlevania. Why are there no enemies that just attack you at sword level? And they all seem to take multiple hits to kill. And also you have this fire-shooting fennel staff, but the thing is incredibly lame. I mean, come on guys, when you give me like a fire weapon, I don't want it to look like this, I want it to look more like this. This silly little pea shooter of a fennel staff will not work for me. Well, the thing is, almost everyone in the world loves this game but me. When I check out the user reviews on GameFAQs, for example, over half the reviewers rated either 9 or 10 out of 10. I guess because it's one of the relatively few of these games that were actually released outside of Japan. But is this really any better than, say, Chesterfield? I mean, bland backgrounds, sort of boring level design. At least Castlevania 2 had cool castles, and Phazanadu had much more interesting levels to explore than this thing. The game was developed by Imagineer, who don't really have a whole lot of impressive work on their resume. They did a lot of ports of American computer games to Japanese systems, some Ultima games, Populous, Doom, that sort of thing. This is far and away their most well-known title outside of Japan. I think I finally lost it at the forest level. Screen after screen of identical looking forest with doors that take you to more forest. And there's bats in this level too? I understand the cave level, but bats attacking you from trees? So I think at this point that's it, I've officially had it with this game. Within weeks of the Famicom version of Nobunaga's Ambition hitting the shelves, two very similar games came out, the first of which is Takeda Shingen from Hot B. I had earlier bemoaned just how awful the name Hot B was, and CRV pointed out that apparently it stands for He's Over There Because, which is maybe even worse than just Hot B. So anyway, Takeda Shingen, he was a real guy, a daimyo who was a rival to Nobunaga. The one story surrounding his death was he was killed by a sniper while preparing for an upcoming battle. You might be familiar with the story from the Akira Kurosawa movie Kagemusha, which was inspired by stories about Takeda, who supposedly also used impersonators to confuse his enemies. Oh, and by the way, in Nobunaga's Ambition, Takeda is one of the other playable daimyos, so I guess in some ways this is sort of his second video game. So this looks pretty similar to Koei's game. Here's the main map screen here. You have your various stats and options to improve your fief, raise an army, that sort of thing. Really not that much different than Nobunaga's Ambition. The battles, however, are handled very differently here. They're turn-based, but you control individual soldiers with move and attack options, a bit like Noit Sane. I put in some footage from the demo mode here in a second to show sort of what a battle actually looks like with, more soldiers. When I was playing this, I didn't actually take the time to, raise a real army. Okay, here we go here. Incidentally, the sequel to this was released in the United States, and you can play it, though it's a lot different than this game, and it is still sort of lame. So the main question here is, how did developers get this game on the market so quickly? I can only assume that those in the industry knew that Koei was working on a port of Nobunaga, and Hot B managed to get a game at about the same time. Still, whenever I see very similar titles all coming out within like weeks or days of each other, it strikes me as being a little odd. Not bad music here. Until that horrible noise comes in during the lightning. Hey, just last episode in my little history of Taito, I was complaining about Taito's lack of good console exclusive games. And then along comes Fudo Myouoden, aka Demon Sword, which sort of proves my point. Now watch as I'm playing this game here and you'll see me die very, very quickly. So this is an original Famicom title from Taito, though it's clearly the spiritual successor to Legend of Kaga. But of course, Taito decided to get the very best to make this game. That's right, this was made by Tosa, though it's not really that bad once you get the hang of it. As long as you have no problem with enemies constantly dropping out of nowhere from every angle possible, the game is playable. Now I should point out that the US release of Demon Sword was altered quite a bit from the original. Let's take a look. This is perhaps maybe a bit more of impressive intro and music here. Very stark and dramatic. That's either fire or the wind is blowing through your red shag carpet. Now the game looks sort of the same, but there is one big difference, however. Holy cow, no life bar? How is it even possible, you say? No one could beat the game like this. Well, there is a special power-up that enemies drop in the Japanese version that allows you to take extra hits. Actually, I can take 2 hits right now without losing a life. The good thing is you can collect quite a few of these if you work at it, thus allowing you to potentially take a lot more hits than in the US version. Now about the name, Fudo Myouoden is a Buddhist deity of sorts, generally seen surrounded by flames, carrying a sword and a rope. He looks like kind of a mean guy, but he actually protects people from disaster and disease and uses his rope to lasso demons. Well, fighting demons seems to be the main focus of this game. This is the US version again, and here's the first boss. Now, an important part of the game is to collect power-ups by defeating standard enemies. Keys to open locked doors, special magic to make boss fights easier. I guess it's a good idea to like stand around and kill enemies until you're stocked up on special items. It's like Taito and Toza decided to bring grinding into side-scrolling action games. Here's one of the power-ups here. Gives you kind of like, shadow warriors that go behind you. Another one will give you multiple throwing stars. It's interesting how much this game resembles the later Ninja Gaiden games, from some of the power-ups to the actual shape of the demon blade. Can't even really tell if I'm doing damage to that guy or not. I'll activate some ninja fire magic here. It's a couple of fireballs that will sort of circle around you and damage enemies. And again, the exact same sort of magic appeared in one of the Ninja Gaiden games. Now for the US release, the game was simplified quite a bit. Some levels were cut out, and a number of power-ups was greatly reduced. Here's the Japanese version again. Let's take a look at all the extra power-ups we have here. Whoa, there's a whole bunch of them. It's a shame, but neither version is really that much fun to play. It's possible that if you practice a bit and get the hang of this thing, you might enjoy it, or possibly not. One day after Takeda Shingen, we have Fleet Commander, a more old-school military simulation game from ASCII. I suspect a World War II theme here. Note the turbo file option. That's what they call saved files in this game. ASCII seems to specialize in ports, often of computer games, but I couldn't find anything about an earlier version of this, so maybe it really is the original title. Like the vast majority of ASCII games, this was never released outside of Japan. So from the main map screen here, you select individual ships in your fleet. That's the list of them on the right-hand side there. I'm going to move the Yamato. Select the move option, and then point where you want your ship to move to. Each ship can only move once per turn. Then you continue with the next ship in your fleet, and when you're all done, hit end, and it's exciting stuff. Now, this being a realistic game, naturally you can't see the enemy fleet. You need to just sort of head over to the top of the screen, and eventually you'll probably run into them. You also have submarines and aircraft, though the aircraft obviously have limited fuel. It should be pointed out there is a somewhat realistic component to this game. All the ships are real ships. The Yamato was the pride of the Japanese Navy, and the biggest battleship in the war. It was sunk by the Allies, of course. I'll go ahead and move one of my airplanes here. They can move pretty far per turn. And there we go. Great stuff, huh? Here's the two sides. I'm not sure why they're called Proton and Algon. Anyway, eventually you'll encounter enemy ships and a battle will ensue. There's battles of ship versus ship, aircraft versus ship, and so on. Aircraft versus aircraft. You don't really do anything during these battles. They seem sort of purely random with maybe, I assume, the ship stats factored in. Oh, here I'm battling the Fletcher, a ship that went on to fight in the Korean War as well. I guess this kind of gives you, if you're Japanese, a chance to sort of win the war for a change. Now, there were a few sequels to this game. There was a Fleet Commander 2 that was released for computers. I don't believe there was any sort of console release for that. Let's take a look at the MSX2 version. I'm not sure if this came out on other computers. 1990, as we can see here. And incidentally, there was also a Game Boy Fleet Commander in 1991. I'm pretty sure none of these ever came out in the United States. Now, I'm not really a big expert on naval warfare games, but this game does seem a little lame. I mean, one thing that's not really apparent in the edited video is that the CPU takes very long turns thinking after you've made your move. In the earlier part of the game, it moves your ships, you move your ships, and then you wait and wait and wait, and then move again. It can actually get pretty boring waiting for the computer to finish making its move. And why doesn't it allow you to move your ships on the main map, where you can actually see where you're moving to? Well, anyway, if you ever wondered about playing, Capcom's 1942 games, hey, why is this about the US defeating Japan? Well, I guess here's the antidote. You can have the Yamato sink the Missouri, defeat the Allied Navy, and prevent Japan's defeat. And it's more Data East. Sadly, this is not another Karnoff, but instead a graphic adventure game based on a popular manga. Be-Bop High School. What exactly is the fascination with the word bebop in Japanese pop culture anyway? Note the copyright to Young Magazine. It has appeared in Young Jump magazine since 1983, and the series actually concerns a couple of high school tough guys with ridiculous hairstyles. Almost immediately after the strip started, a series of live-action movies was produced, including 2 in 1988. Now, I will say one thing. Data East obviously took great care in reproducing Kyuichi Kazuhiro's art style for the characters here. The problem is, Kyuichi's art is quite grotesque, and he's fond of drawing characters with enormous Neanderthal-like brow ridges, and these horrifying death rictus grins on their faces. Seriously, these grins, I guess you would call them shit-eating grins, appear quite frequently in the comics and the game. The bottom line is, in Be-Bop High School, you're going to see some of the ugliest character art you'll ever see. I mentioned this was a graphical adventure game, meaning you can move your character around in the world with your joystick, in sort of like the King's Quest style, as opposed to the more traditional Portopia style, where everything is done through menus. This is, of course, the way most Japanese visual novels still operate today. I guess it's just a coincidence, but High School Kimengumi and Sukaban Deka, the Sega adventure games, used similar ideas where you controlled your character directly. Maybe games set in high schools like this formula? Well, throughout the game you'll encounter a wide variety of weird-looking characters. Even your girlfriend looks kind of freaky. And since you're a punk, you have the option of fighting with people you meet. You can actually hit them in the face. That's one of the commands in the menu. Seems one of the first challenges is simply to leave the school. There's a cop car parked out in front that'll block your path. Once you get rid of the cops, you can cross the street and visit some sort of shopping center. Again, more seriously creepy and ugly characters here. Even though we're outlaw types, we'll use the crosswalk. One of the locations is a Data East arcade. Deco, of course, is Data East Company. But something that's weird, it mentions Afterburner in the lower right-hand corner there. Why would they list a Sega game? Did Data East distribute the game somewhere? It's pretty odd. So obviously this is a bit different than your run-of-the-mill adventure game. We have a couple more adventure games next episode, including one of the very few that was released outside of Japan, so we'll be looking forward to that. So now we're getting into the obscure stuff. Aspic, an archaic action RPG for the FDS. It's funny, in late 1987 we had all these RPGs all come out at once, and it's been pretty quiet since then. Published by Botek, the original game was by Crystalsoft, which they spell with an X. There's an introductory text scroll, but no opening cutscenes or anything like that. So you start off at the castle. It's weird how NPCs are depicted as these white, ghostly figures as they approach you. And putting go every single time you take a step seems a little unnecessary. So the game is off to a rather irritating start. Go. Now this is naturally a port of a computer game. We're getting hell of old school here. It was released in 1986 on cassette for the NEC PC 6001, as well as the FM7 and the Sharp X1. The 6001 was the predecessor to the 8801. This is pretty unpleasant on the eyes, but don't expect the Famicom version to be much of an upgrade. Fight mode, yeah. There you have it. Good stuff. Now here's the thing. For some reason, the programmers decided to give this MSX-style scrolling. Yep, the Famicom was noted for its ability to do smooth scrolling, but somehow that's not what we get here. I don't know if this was due to unfamiliarity with programming for the Famicom, or if they were deliberately going for a retro feel, but it makes moving around in this game not a lot of fun. Now the cool thing about Aspic, well, assuming there is a cool thing about this game, is that you can convince these swordsmen to come and join your party without fighting them, and then you can actually have them fight monsters instead of you. Or you can also attack them like I'm doing here. A good idea that's seen from time to time in RPGs of this era, but I don't think it's really used in a particularly creative fashion here, as compared to say Megami Tensei, where you could crossbreed friendly monsters and whatnot. Now as mentioned, this is an action RPG. Battles performed one-on-one against enemies on a separate screen. Basically, you just run up and hit them with your sword. There are magic points, so I assume you learn some magic eventually. The one thing I didn't see happening was any sort of leveling up. I played around until I got about to maybe 100 experience points, but never saw my stats increase, so who knows. Maybe this is one of those games where you have to go talk to the king in order to power up or something like that. I saw a dungeon, or rather a hole in the ground I assumed was a dungeon, but I couldn't really find the way to enter it. But the dungeons are in fact in first-person mode, just like the castles and the houses. And by the way, if you're wondering what Aspic actually is, it's like a meat jelly, sort of like gelatin, that no one really seems to eat too much of nowadays. It sort of implies preservation, which seems appropriate because this game is essentially a preserved specimen of a now extinct variety of RPGs. I can't really say I'd recommend this. Hey, it's been a while since we've seen a Namco game, but they're back with Dokuganryu Masamune, One-Eyed Dragon Masamune. If you suspect this is a historical-themed strategy game, well then, you win the prize. Though this game is quite a bit different, and slicker and more polished than the Takeda Shingen game, as would be expected from Namco. The interface, with your little talking assistant down there at the bottom you saw a moment ago, makes this sort of resemble a Portopia-style adventure game. Unlike Koei's and Hot B's strategy games, there's quite a bit of dialogue here. So anyway, about Date Masamune, he was yet another Sengoku-era daimyo. Once again, he is in Nobunaga's ambition. He has a couple distinctive characteristics. His extremely badass helmet, as you can see there with the large crescent moon on it. That's actually one of the most famous samurai helmets. And the fact that he only had one eye, hence the name of this game. And one difference between this guy and Nobunaga and Takeda Shingen is that he survived the Sengoku period wars and got along decently with the new shogun, and he actually sort of did alright for himself. And yeah, Final Fantasy fans, if you're wondering, no, the Masamune sword is not named after him. It's named after a different Masamune. And of course, he also found his way into those Kessen and Samurai Warriors games. Koei uses pretty much all these guys in their games. Now this does seem a bit simpler than Nobunaga, not as many options. You can spy on your neighbors, buy weapons from the merchant, that's the merchant there by the way. You know, raise an army, employ ninjas, the usual stuff. What I'll do here in a moment is I'll get ready to go to war with another daimyo, which turns out to be a pretty bad idea because I'm quite outnumbered there, as you can see. The battles play out in a reasonably dramatic fashion. You have this cavalry and infantry, you control each group of soldiers in a turn-based fashion. Engagement occurs automatically. Two groups of soldiers will just start fighting once they actually collide. I guess this works pretty well. Sadly, I'm going to get my tail whooped here, as is expected. Well, this is actually it for the military strategy games this episode, but there actually is one more next time. Finally, the big game this episode, from Technos, it's Double Dragon, one of the most successful games on the NES. But let's check out the cool music. That music just perfectly conveys the feeling of triumph and punching, which is what Double Dragon is all about. As we will recall, Double Dragon first appeared in arcades in 1987, a sequel to Technos' earlier Renegade. This is the classic beat-em-up plot. Your girlfriend is kidnapped by thugs, who live all the way over on the right side of town. This was a huge hit in arcades at the time, and was the game that sort of led to the beat-em-up mania of the late 80s and early 90s. But the most notable feature was the two-player co-op, which was quite cool. For example, one of you could grab a bad guy from behind, pinning his arms, while the other could repeatedly punch him. However, there was quite a lot of characters on the screen often all at once, which would lead to some pretty heavy slowdown, as we can see here. With two players, the slowdown could get quite bad. Regardless, still an extremely popular game in arcades at the time. So anyway, here's the intro to the Famicom version. Your girl seems to be wearing a longer skirt here, so it's missing the panty shot from the arcade game, and your badass Trans Am is also absent. In fact, the console Double Dragon is full of compromises. Most notably, there is no two-player co-op. Yes, that's right, the main feature of the arcade game has been removed. Also, only two enemies at once could appear on screen, so you're not facing big crowds of enemies here. One widely copied feature in Double Dragon was the ability to pick up weapons dropped by enemies, as well as certain background objects like barrels or boulders. This obviously became standard in beat-em-ups, but it's also normal for first-person shooters nowadays as well. I don't really recall seeing this much in games prior to Double Dragon. It was used a bit in Mega Man, obviously, but the idea of just being able to use any weapon dropped by an enemy seems to have been pretty new at the time. I'll have to think about that. Well, anyway, there are fewer objects that can be used as weapons in the home version. In the arcade game, having a supply of boulders lying around makes some of the fights a bit more manageable, though some of the handheld weapons like the whip and the bat seem a bit more useful here. Perhaps as a result, any weapons will disappear when you move on to the next section. So Double Dragon is divided into 4 levels, each with a boss at the end, and also increasing numbers of sub-bosses. The first 2 levels are pretty simple. After that, the difficulty increases rather dramatically. Here is Adobo, the first boss. Another feature unique to the home version is the level up system. As you kill enemies, you gain hearts. You see your hearts down there in the bottom left. As you gain hearts, you get new abilities. I just got an extra heart there. We'll start the game with just a basic kick and punch, but later you'll get some sort of like little mini combos and new moves, including an insanely useful hair grab, where you grab the hair, knee him in the face, and you can actually throw him as well. However, since there are a set number of enemies in each level, you can't really grind to increase your hearts, not without utilizing a glitch. There's the hair grab and throw right there. Later levels get a bit weirder. You'll find yourself wandering around in caves and some sort of ancient temple. I guess this gang really wanted their hideout to be completely off the beaten path. And Technos added some sequences involving dodging falling stalactites and jumping on moving platforms, though in my opinion these detract from the overall game. And while Billy is pretty good at punching and kicking, jumping is not his strong point. While fighting in Double Dragon is very polished, the platforming just feels like sort of like intrusive irritations. Now, we were discussing Taito last episode and their waning fortunes in the console era. They distributed Double Dragon in the arcades and of course Renegade, and I go so far as to say that Double Dragon may have been their last huge arcade hit. They got the NES version of Renegade out in the US pretty quickly, so you might think that the NES Double Dragon would have been a huge goldmine for them. Well, actually, no. I'm not sure how or why, but the rights to Double Dragon on the Nintendo Entertainment System in the United States ended up with a small Texan company called Tradewest. This was their first console released. Previously, they had handled US distribution of some SNK arcade games, including Victory Road. Soon, Tradewest would hire Rare to develop games, including, of course, Battletoads. A few years later, Tradewest was bought up by Williams and became a part of the Midway Williams Group. Technos would end up releasing US versions themselves in the near future. So at the end of the 4th level, you face a seemingly endless parade of tough enemies, and then fight the arcade game's boss. But this version has a new final boss. Yep, the guy behind the kidnapping of your girlfriend is actually Jimmy, your own brother. He was of course the guy you played as the second player in the arcade game. Yeah, it's a pretty shocking conclusion. It's a tough fight, sort of like Solid Snake versus Liquid Snake or something. Double Dragon does get pretty brutal near the end, especially since you can't get extra lives and there's no continues. When you die, unlike the arcade game, you don't like instantly rematerialize. The section starts over from the beginning. Thus, at the end of that last level, you have to beat the series of strong enemies without dying. Now, in place of the 2-player co-op, Technos added a 2-player versus mode. Sort of a mini fighting game. You can choose between many of the game's characters, and they all have different moves. Also, the sprites have been redrawn from those in the main game. It's a nice touch, but doesn't really quite replace the co-op option. Now, the weird thing about Double Dragon is, even though so many compromises were made, it's still a great game. I suppose the console version is more well-loved than the arcade game. A more faithful port was released for the Sega Master System by Sega themselves later in '88, but nobody cares about that game. Like Contra, it's a port that managed to outlive the original to a certain extent. Double Dragon, who cares? Here's the one I know you've really been waiting for, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Another one of those worst ever NES game candidates, having been rather famously panned by the angry video game nerd, and something awful. When you look at the user reviews at GameFAQs, 1 out of 10 is the most common score. Alright, so this game is awful, but I wouldn't even say it's the worst game this episode. Now first of all, it's bad when the general gameplay rules are not something that could be figured out just by playing the game. If you have the card and no manual, or you're just plopping the ROM into an emulator, you're not really going to understand what's going on here. Much of the animosity towards Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is because if you don't know how to play, you're going to die very quickly, and the game won't even really explain to you why you died. You start off as Dr. Jekyll on your wedding day, walking to your wedding. You know, since the church is so far away and the local citizens are so obnoxious, you really should have hired a cab to drive you there. Well, on the streets, kids will shoot slingshots at you, people run into you, animals attack you, and a mad bomber sets off bombs everywhere. There are 2 meters, the life meter and the meter meter. Taking a hit will decrease one or both of these meters. If your life runs out, well, then you die. But if the meter, or stress meter as the manual calls it, fills up, that's when the game gets hairy. You turn into Mr. Hyde. Because Mr. Hyde has sort of like a negative mental attitude on life or something like that, when you play as him, the world is all topsy-turvy. You move in the opposite direction, and it's like Castlevania 2 at night. Everyone's become a monster. So here's the deal. You have a punch, but don't use it. Instead, pressing up and B will shoot the Psycho Wave mentioned so prominently on the box art. Every time you kill a monster with a Psycho Wave, your stress meter goes down. Once it's empty again, you transform back to Dr. Jekyll. When you become Mr. Hyde for the first time, you start playing back at the beginning of the first level. Hyde can't ever catch up with Dr. Jekyll. If while playing at Hyde you reach the place in the game where you left off as Dr. Jekyll, then according to the manual, God himself will intervene and kill you with a lightning bolt. So it's sort of like a weird race between the two, and you want Jekyll to win. Now, there's a lot of enemies, but far and away the most dangerous is that Mad Bomber guy. He'll drop a bomb right as he passes you, and then you need to get the hell away from the bomb, or take massive damage and stress. For some reason, you end up taking far less damage if you are on the left side of the bomb when it goes off. Now, we've been playing the US version from Bandai, but the original game was published by Toho, the film studio. The developer, Advanced Communications, let their name be displayed rather boldly on the opening credits. The original version is a little different, namely there's a couple extra levels. In fact, the first level is not on the US version at all. And starts off in a much more difficult fashion. Almost immediately you'll run into a series of mad bombers, whose bombs will instantly turn you to Hyde if they go off behind you. Since this is at the very beginning of the game, it's impossible to reset your stress meter before reaching the same spot as Jekyll, so getting killed by lightning is guaranteed. There are bombers in the first level of the US version, but their bombs take longer to go off, so usually you can avoid taking too much damage. There's also some characters in the Japanese versions not found in the Bandai version, like these folks throwing things at each other from the windows. Pretty annoying. However, on a positive note, there's a lady who will invite you up, Zelda 2 style, and refill your health and empty your stress meter. Now, I know what you're thinking, but that's not it, because she gives you money. Does this mean that Dr. Jekyll is some sort of male prostitute? So, what do the coins do? Well, this one particular character sings, apparently very badly, and her notes will damage you quite a bit if you touch them. If you have enough money, she'll stop singing when you touch her. But this seems to be the only use for the coins. There isn't actually anything to, buy in the game. One thing about this game is it's not at all consistent. Some parts are absurdly easy, others very annoying. I hate the spiders because you have to sneak below them and you can't just barrel through them because you will get knocked backwards whenever you touch an enemy. When there are tons of running characters and the kid shooting at you and the bomb maniac constantly dropping bombs, it becomes virtually impossible to sneak past the spiders. Well, this really is a bad game. Pretty much nothing is explained in the game, and the basic game mechanics are very counterintuitive. Jekyll has a cane, but you shouldn't use it. Hyde can punch enemies, but you don't want to kill them by punching, you want to use the Psycho Wave. The game has money, but it really isn't implemented in an interesting fashion. Your character moves way too slow, and it's difficult to avoid many enemies. This really has nothing to do with the original story. In fact, the developers seem to have sort of added elements of the Incredible Hulk to the story. So definitely, stupid game. Is it one of the worst games on the system? Probably not. I'd say it's better than Kamen Rider Black, which we'll see in a couple minutes. Well, I guess the big genre at this time period, other than military strategy games, is desert-themed rally games. We've had Victory Run on the PC Engine, and of course Paris-Dakar Rally, and now from Nintendo it's the Famicom Grand Prix 2 3D Hot Rally. Now first of all, there should be some sort of epilepsy warning included on this game, since there's all kinds of weird flickering and flashing going on here. It's kind of painful to play for very long. Also, I do apologize, this game's going to look weird in spots because of the way that the display at the bottom of the screen appears during the game. There's a really unusual flicker effect going on at all times for this display, maybe attempting to make it look transparent or something like that. Obviously, the 29 frames per second video couldn't capture it properly, so the display doesn't really show up like it should. Sometimes it looks perfectly normal, it's not flashing at all. Other times it'll just disappear completely, so sorry if this looks a little bit weird at times. I remember the first Famicom Grand Prix was from October 1987. That was a top-down racing game, and this one is an Outrun clone, right down to the forks in the road. 3D Hot Rally is actually sort of shameless the way it rips off Outrun. One unique Nintendo touch, all the roadside objects, street lamps, etc. all have faces on them. You drive through a wide variety of conditions, roads, deserts, snow. Every time you hit something, your car takes damage. If the, oh yeah, this looks pretty crazy when you're playing the game itself. That past section right there. If the damage meter completely fills up, it's game over. But don't forget to set a repair spot, like I did when I was playing this game. You can actually repair manually at any time, but you lose time while doing so. Now the coolest thing, maybe the only cool thing, is the hot meter, and unfortunately you can't see it here. When you collect those exclamation points with H found on the middle of the roadway, it fills up the meter. Shifting from 4th gear into hot gives you a huge temporary speed boost. There's really nothing special or fun about this game. It's inferior to Rad Racer and Victory Run, and even Taito Grand Prix, I think. Just a run-of-the-mill racer from HAL Labs and Nintendo. There never was a Famicom Grand Prix 3, so I guess no one wasn't too impressed by this game. Here is the real worst game this episode, another FDS game from Bandai. Check out this amazing intro here. Best part of the game. Honestly, if this is the dance you have to do to transform into Kamen Rider, I don't think it was worth it. Wait a second, did we just have a Kamen Rider game from Bandai? Yeah, but that was just plain old Kamen Rider. This is Kamen Rider Black, a new TV series that was on the air when this game came out. There have been countless different Kamen Rider series over the years, but they all involve guys wearing bug helmets. Now let me start out by saying something that'll be very obvious. This is a really bad game. It looks like just a standard side-scrolling platform type game, but it's a lot worse than it looks. First of all, the controls are really bad. One button punches, the other jumps, but if you want to kick, press up on the D-pad. Yeah, I know, what? And your jumping is subpar, even by terrible 80s cash-in game standards. You always jump straight up, and pressing left or right while in mid-air will cause you to do some sort of like roll in the air, and then move a little bit to the left or the right. Other than that, you cannot control your jump at all. And why do you jump so high? You actually jump into the status bar at the top of the screen. Well, lots of games we've seen have had bad jumping. What makes this one so bad? Well, most awful games have had something weird, funny, or unique about them. The first Kamen Rider game had those bizarre RPG-like battles, for example. Kamen Rider Black lacks pretty much anything interesting about it. It's like everything you normally associate with video games has been sucked out, leaving an empty black hole of a game. Level design? There is none. Just a stretch of flat ground with the barest backgrounds. Imaginable. Action? When an enemy comes at you, you hit the punch button. Same with bosses, you just walk up and keep punching it. Hit detection? It barely exists. You can kill enemies by punching over their heads, but on bosses you'll often find yourself punching over and over again without it registering a hit. From what I've played, the game is simply walk to the end of the level, fight the boss, and then repeat. The main frustrations will be the incredibly slow pace at which your character walks. The unresponsive controls, simply turning around is difficult, and the fact that you will get hit by these impossible to dodge projectiles. They do very little damage, so just keep walking and try to ignore them. Trying to jump to avoid projectiles is really a wasted effort. Now when you get to the very final boss of each level, there's slightly bigger sprites for some reason, similar to Double Dragon and Predator. But compared to this, I mean, even Predator is a work of genius. Now, after this, you do end up getting a motorcycle, which will at least make the game go a little bit faster, but still, even nothing really happens. You'll need to, like, jump over a cliff or two. Yeah, this is about it on the motorcycle right here. The one thing that impressed me is when you hit a bump, you'll actually fly off and land on your face, which is pretty awesome looking. That's really about the only thing in this game they put any effort into at all. Yeah, there you go. And check out this upcoming boss battle to see what I mean by really baffling hit detection. I was surprised to learn this was developed by Human, who normally turn out, well, competent if not inspired work. But Kamen Rider is not just a bad game, it's barely a game at all. There's absolutely nothing here that could be considered enjoyable. I'm not going to say this is the worst game I've seen so far, but it comes pretty close, just due to the fact of it having no redeeming qualities whatsoever. This really was one of the most agonizing, least enjoyable games I've played on this show so far. Jalico is at it again with Moero Pro Tennis, the first in 2 Jalico games this episode. Released in the West as Racket Attack, this is the second game in Jalico's Moero Sport series, the first being Moero Pro Yaku, otherwise known as Bases Loaded. Just like the first game, this is developed by Toza. I guess, they're everywhere nowadays. So this is a bit more advanced than Nintendo's old tennis game. You can choose your players, all with their own strengths, much like Lee Trevino's Fighting Golf, and each with their own really stupid name. I mean, Horn, Eagle, First? Who came up with these names? So choose your player, and you can also choose what kind of court you want to have. There's hard, clay, or grass. Grass being the softest. This type of sort of affecting, how your ball will bounce and how fast it goes. The main novelty in this game is that, just like most baseball games, it uses 2 different cameras. There's this wide view of the entire court when you're serving, and then it switches to a close-up view while the ball's in play. Couple things I should mention. Jalico apparently had a deal with the tennis racket manufacturer Wilson in the US. The box art mentions a contest to win some tennis stuff from Wilson. Their name actually appears in the game, but in the Japanese version, as we see here, the Wilson logo is completely missing. Didn't appear in the European version either. So how's the game? Well, it's not bad, I suppose. It plays decently, but it's nothing too exciting. Obviously, Jalico are going for a more realistic feel in their sports games than Nintendo or Namco. One thing, it is pretty easy to miss the ball. You seem to have a bit of momentum when you run, and it's possible to not stop in time to hit the ball. You kind of actually go right past it. Other times, the ball just sort of passes right through you. Just like Bases Loaded, some speech samples are used. Compare these 2 samples in the next game coming up and you'll see they're quite good. So I guess it's a pretty decent tennis game. I don't really care that much for this sort of thing myself, but it certainly could be a lot worse. Got another one here, folks, a game many of you know and hate, Ikari Warriors 2. This title screen just pretty much says it all. It's a one ugly title screen. The game itself isn't so hot looking either. Is the Japanese version any better? Well, yeah, a little, but still, neither version has any music, which is usually a sign from the developer that, hey, we don't give a shit. And both have horrible speech samples. I know the Famicom was capable of better than this. So as you might have figured out, this is a port of the 1986 SNK arcade game known as Victory Road in the US and Dokuganryu in Japan. Not surprisingly, the speech is a bit more understandable here, and there's a lot more enemies as well. Just like Ikari, this game controls using a rotary joystick, so you can aim and move independently. For the home version, I guess they sort of wanted to play up the Ikari Warriors connection, so it was renamed Ikari Warriors 2. Just like the first Ikari Warriors, this was ported by Micronix. Now the controls are a major issue here. It's really hard to get your guy to both move and shoot in the direction you want him to. For some reason, Capcom was able to port over Commando to the NES without control problems, and even the first Ikari had okay controls, but this one, something is just not right. Part of the problem is the general uselessness of the machine gun. It's better to switch to the boomerang. Yep, it's easier to kill aliens with a boomerang than a machine gun in this game. With a boomerang, you don't have to quite even try to aim so much. Now, weapons have levels, so you'll find power-ups for the weapons scattered here and there. Luckily, your ammo and grenades are infinite, so you can throw grenades around all you want. So an obvious question, what is with the little weird black screens that appear for a moment when entering the inventory menu? They're like loading screens? How did Micronix get loading screens on a cartridge? It's baffling. Oh no, I'm being sucked into a vortex. This is actually a minigame that appears from time to time. It's sort of like shooting skeets, but here's the catch. That oval moving around is your gun sight. When you shoot the discs, not only does your bullet have to hit the disc, but your gun sight has to touch the disc at the same time the bullet hits. So you've got to get your gun sight, bullet, and target all touching at the same time. Why? I mean, physicists haven't been able to solve the three-body problem, but they expect us to be able to get three moving objects to all collide together at once? Now, if you hit enough, you'll win hearts. If not, you'll lose hearts. The whole heart thing is new to the home version. The hearts are actually those red and black things that appear when you kill an enemy. Rather than being a simple shooter, you now have money in shops. Here's one of the shops here. You can buy weapons and whatnot in shops, but also engage in arena fights. And oddly enough, the guys that you fight look totally different when sitting at the bar than when you actually fight them in the arena. Here you need to toss grenades, which are damn hard to aim properly. And this game doesn't even bother to give you any kind of indication when your grenade actually hits the enemy. You know, the enemy should flash or make a noise, just like every other video game in the world. But Ikari 2 is missing a lot of things you sort of normally take for granted in video games. A full range of sound effects, for example. Grenades make a noise when you throw them, but they're silent when they explode. The whole game just sort of feels half-finished. When playing Ikari Warriors 2, nothing really feels right. And to top it off, you only have one life, so if you die it's game over. Even Double Dragon gives you 3 lives. I guess Ikari Warriors fails on almost every level. Horrible graphics, the original used more than just gray and red for colors, and your character doesn't even have feet. Barely existent sound, terrible controls, general lack of sense. This is one really bad game, so way to go, Micronix. The last good game this episode is another FDS game, this time from Konami. Hooray! This is a title that's felt quite a bit of a cult following, maybe one you've heard of, Miracle Bokutte Upa, the title of which has been translated as Miracle, I'm Upa. Yes, you are Upa, the heroic baby on a mission to, as far as I can tell, rescue the kidnapped babies of the kingdom from a prairie dog with horns. Now, despite his extreme youth, Upa is pretty tough, and is armed with a rattle that will actually inflate enemies and cause them to float away. While floating away, you can hit them, cause them to go flying off at high speed, knocking out any other enemies they strike. So they're sort of like Koopas in the sky. Another very important use for them is you can jump on inflated enemies and reach even higher platforms. And that's pretty much the game in a nutshell. Now, RPG elements, money, shops, branching paths, minigame, there's none of that in here. Miracle is an example of taking one simple concept and executing it very well. I love that little power-up you have there where you're temporarily able to walk around on 2 legs and you become invincible as well. The vast majority of the game is sort of like a Mario-like side-scrolling platforming, but just like Mario's, they sort of switched up a bit. Oh, and I love that brutal flamethrower used to toast the enemies there. And a second ago we had that one level where you were actually eating your way through a giant cake of some sort. Most levels end in a boss fight, usually against this pink pig. He shoots out standard enemies, which you must then inflate and bounce back at him. This particular battle is probably the easiest in the game. Later battles have layouts where there's usually a more difficult position to actually get a hit in, or you have only a small amount of room to actually maneuver around in. Once you hit him a certain number of times, he'll die in a chest full of fairies will escort you to the next level. Sometimes a second chest with an extra life will appear. Each world has 3 levels, and there are 7 worlds altogether, so the game is broken up sort of, just like Super Mario Bros. Which leads to an interesting point. One thing that took me by surprise while doing Chrontendo was that there wasn't really a big old huge flood of Mario clones released for the Famicom. Sure, there were lots of side-scrolling games, but very few that we could look at and say, hey, this is a Mario ripoff. And out of all these platforming games, there really haven't been very many good ones. I mean, there were a few Adventure Islands, but many more horrible games like Miracle Bokutte. Upa, on the other hand, is blatantly inspired by Mario, even some of the music sounds similar. It adds a fresh new mechanic, inflating enemies, and introduces sort of its own complete unique aesthetic and sense of level design. Each world has its own theme, but there's usually it's based around the world of something that kids would know about, there's cakes, candies, bottles of milk, school supplies, alphabet blocks, mixed in with platforming staples like the ice level, the underwater level, levels with conveyor belts. Unlike, say, Adventure Island, Upa never repeats itself. Each world is different, and the game is always introducing new things. We get new enemies up to the very last world. Here's one of the bosses, a pompous-looking walrus wearing a top hat. Perhaps the most original and surprising moment is this level. The entire level that is upside down with gravity reversed. Yep, this one really messes with your head. I don't really know how the computer theme fits in with a baby theme, but like I was saying, Konami keeps this game fresh. It's never predictable. This level is actually pretty difficult, just because it asks you to like sort of think a bit differently than normal. And then after this we get like one of those classic conveyor belt levels. Dangerous flying pencils and squids for some reason. I love the way they use those colored pencils up there as spikes. It's a bit ironic that last episode I was complaining about Taito and they're releasing Warden no Mori on the FDS, since I thought that technical limitations were responsible for that game's ugliness. Well, I need to take that back, because this game proves that it was perfectly possible to make a great looking game by 1988 standards on the FDS. There aren't any fancy effects on display, but everything is well rendered and the color scheme is always pleasing. Having seen so many Famicom games with really ugly colors, I was actually very impressed. Now, despite Bio-Miracle's unusually cute and colorful appearance, the game is not afraid to throw some punishment at you. In later levels, more enemies appear that target you directly, and you have to sort of play around to find the best way through a level to avoid taking too much damage. Because of the inflatable enemies, you'll often find that you have multiple ways through the level, like sort of taking like the top part of the screen or the bottom part of the screen. I wouldn't really call it, branching paths, but you have a lot of choices. By this point, the game is pulling out all the stops and trying to kill you. Constant blind jumps and spikes everywhere. In most games, this would be unreasonable, but Konami never takes it too far. Extra lives are plentiful, and stuff, like that jumping level sort of balances out with less deadly sections. The final level even takes place in a castle of sorts, mixing up horizontal and vertical movement. Finally, you'll reach the last boss, who looks more like some evil demon, goat wizard, when you fight him. Konami eventually gave this game a cartridge release in Japan, which is pretty much identical. It was never officially released in the United States, but someone obviously picked up on the Mario-osity of the game, and pirated versions under the name Baby Mario could be found for a while. Though once again the game itself was not changed. It's odd that it took about 2.5 years after Super Mario Bros. For a really worthy successor to come out on Famicom. Sega did it with Alex Kidd, but that was sort of a flawed game in some ways. Here I really can't find anything to complain about. The game is just the right length, it's consistently fun and creative, it's never really that frustrating, the visuals are always delightful, it's one of the most impressive games for the Famicom in 1988 so far, and one of the few that I recommend pretty much with no reservations. Well, we're almost to the end of April, and our last game this episode is an FDS release from Jalico, Fuuun Shaolin Kyo and Koku no Maou. This is a sequel. The first game came out almost exactly 1 year ago in April 1987. I don't know if you remember it. Quite frankly, I barely remember it myself. Well, both games are early one-on-one fighting games. I suppose the forefather of these sorts of games is ER Kung Fu from Konami, the Chinese-themed fighting game. Seems to drop you straight into the middle of the plot here, and your first opponent is yourself. I always thought the palette swap of your own character was supposed to come like later in the game in these things. Well, anyway, controls are pretty simple. One button punches, the other kicks. Pressing up on the D-pad at the same time as hitting the button will do a high kick or punch. Same with down on the D-pad. And jumping, well, to jump you hit A and B at the same time. What can I say, the Famicom controller only has 2 buttons. And to execute a special spinning kick, you hit A, B, and down simultaneously. If you're looking for easy, intuitive controls, then go play Double Dragon. Granted, I was not able to approach anything resembling mastery this game, but the fight seemed to play out one of 2 ways. I walked up, spammed the kick button, and took out the opponent pretty quickly, or my opponent executed some kind of super move that kills you immediately. Like that guy right there, he punches you like 1,000 times in a row. It's a little hard to see these special attacks coming, and the sprites are so small, and there's really not any kind of like advance warning. But you guess you can't play a game like this expecting it to be anything like a modern fighting game. The graphics are a bit better in the first game, which was pretty boring looking. They go for a bit of atmosphere here. That one level we saw takes place in a lightning storm. Another one has like some wind blowing. Mountains and clouds in the background. You can actually see the clouds sort of move across the background. I saw a limited number of enemies with a lot of palette swaps. I don't know how many enemies there are in total. As was often the case back then, this is a single player only. There's no two-player competitive fighting. So it's hardly a great game. Maybe it would be okay with better controls, or at least an easier to use jump. And the spinning jump is pretty tricky to pull off. It didn't always work when I tried. Some enemies rather annoyingly constantly jump, like this guy is always jumping over you, making him pretty hard to hit. Still, big-time fighting game fans might want to give this one a try. Wow, Ikari 2, Jekyll and Hyde, Kamen Rider Black, what a spectacular collection of crap. So what's up next? Would you believe a cool game from Konami? How about a rare English language Japanese adventure game? Or an obscure Zelda clone I've not played? Maybe we'll get lucky this time. At any rate, I'll see you then.